They're ready to go?
Yes, and I'll get the light set.
Oh, my glasses. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. We're very fortunate that the sun came out for Sant Jordi. Welcome to the Center for Fiction, which is the most perfect place for us to present Irene Vallejo's Papyrus, the history of books in the ancient world. And it's the perfect place to celebrate Sant Jordi, which is the day of books and roses. Of course, it's the death day of Cervantes and Shakespeare, so it's literary in every way. The Sant Jordi USA Festival, this is the first event of the Sant Jordi USA Festival. And if you go to our website, santjordiusa.org, you will see many more events, 2 or 3 more in-person events, and then about 12 hours of online readings from all the languages. Sant Jordi USA is devoted to all the languages of the world, to literature and translation, so that English can be the bridge to everybody else's works. So it is my great pleasure to introduce now the participants in this event. I will start with the person who organized it, who is the translator of the book, Charlotte Whittle. And Charlotte Whittle's work has appeared in the Literary Review, Los Angeles Times, Guernica, Baum, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. Her translations include novels by Jorge Comensal, Elisa Victoria, and Nora Lange. Her most recent translation is Papyrus, the international bestseller by Irene Vallejo. She lives in England and New York. And then we are really, really fortunate to have Sarah Ruden here. If you go to our website, you're going to see her absolutely adorable corgi. Sarah Ruden there couldn't be a better conversation than the one among these three women. A leading translator of ancient texts, including Virgil's Aeneid and Augustine's Confessions. Her book, The Face of Water, a translator on beauty and meaning in the Bible, was published by Knopf, Pantheon in 2017. And she has written for The American Scholar, The Wall Street Journal, and Books and Culture. She is the author of a poetry collection, Other Places, and the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Whiting Award. She lives in Connecticut. And Irene Vallejo, who is the reason we are all here, is the author of the international best-selling Papyrus, The Invention of Books in the Ancient World, which has been translated into over 30 languages. Papyrus was awarded the National Essay Prize and the Critical Eye Prize for Narrative in Spain. Vallejo is a regular columnist for El País and Heraldo de Aragón, and she is the author of 2 novels, 3 collections of essays, articles, and short fiction, and 2 children's books. She lives in Spain, and I'd like to welcome them now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, for that beautiful introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be at the Center for Fiction, especially on Sant Jordi, the Day of Books and Roses in Barcelona. We are going to jump right in with a bilingual reading from the beginning of this extraordinary work, Papyrus. We'll read first in English and then in Spanish. Mysterious bands of men on horseback travel the roads of Greece. The country folk watch them with suspicion from their plots of land or the doors to their huts. They know from experience that only those who represent danger travel: soldiers, mercenaries, and slave traders. They frown and grumble until the men disappear over the horizon. Country folk do not look kindly upon armed strangers. The horsemen ride on, paying the villagers no heed. For months they have climbed mountains, traversed ravines, crossed valleys, forded rivers, and sailed from island to island. Their muscles have hardened and their endurance increased since they were sent on this peculiar mission. To achieve their task, they must venture into violent realms in a world that is almost continually at war. These are hunters in search of a special kind of prey that is silent, cunning, and vanishes without a trace. If these menacing envoys were to sit down in a tavern in some port or other to drink wine, eat seared octopus, talk, and make merry with strangers, something they never do out of caution, they could tell great tales of their travels. They have entered lands racked with plague. They have crossed regions scorched by fire. They have seen the warm ashes of destruction and the brutality of rebels and mercenaries at war. Since maps of extensive territories do not yet exist, they have strayed and wandered directionless for days on end beneath the fury of sun and storms. They've been forced to drink foul waters that have caused them horrendous diarrhea. Whenever it rains, their carts and mules get stuck in the morass. They have pulled amid cries and curses until they collapse to their knees, their faces pressed to the earth. When night falls on them, far from shelter, only their capes shield them from scorpions. Excuse me. They have known the maddening torment of lice and the constant threat of the bandits roaming the roads. Often, as they ride through vast, desolate terrain, they shudder to imagine these outlaws lying in wait, holding their breath, lurking at a bend in the road, ready to fall upon them, murder them in cold blood, plunder their bags, and leave their warm corpses among the bushes. It makes sense for them to be wary. The king of Egypt has entrusted great sums of money to them before sending them to carry out his orders across the sea. In those times, only a few decades after the death of Alexander, it was highly dangerous, almost suicidal, to travel with a large fortune. And though thieves' daggers, contagious diseases, and shipwrecks threaten to cause such an expensive mission to fail, the pharaoh insists on sending his agents out from the country of the Nile, crossing borders and traversing great distances in all directions. The king thirsts after his prey with impatient desire, while his secret hunters scour the earth, facing unknown perils. The country folk who spied from their doorways, or the mercenaries and bandits, would have widened their eyes and dropped their jaws in amazement had they known what those foreign horsemen pursued. Books. They were searching for books. It was the best-kept secret of the Egyptian court. The lord of the two lands, one of the most powerful men of his time, would sacrifice lives, the lives of others, of course, that's always the way with kings, to obtain all the books in the world for his great library in Alexandria. He was chasing the dream of an absolute, perfect library, a collection that would gather together every single work by every single author since the beginning of time. Yeah.
So my first words can only be thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Marianne Newman and the Catalan Institute of America. Thank you to all the team of the Brooklyn Center for Fiction hosting us this afternoon, and these brilliant women who are with me, Charlotte, Sarah. Thank you so much. And now the Spanish version of the beginning of Papyrus. Misteriosos grupos de hombres a caballo recorren los caminos de Grecia. Los campesinos los observan con desconfianza desde sus tierras o desde las puertas de sus cabañas. La experiencia les ha enseñado que solo viaja la gente peligrosa, soldados, mercenarios y traficantes de esclavos. Arrugan la frente y gruñen hasta que los ven hundirse otra vez en el horizonte. No les gustan los forasteros armados. Los jinetes cabalgan sin fijarse en los aldeanos. Durante meses han escalado montañas, han franqueado desfiladeros, han cruzado valles, han vadeado ríos, han navegado de isla en isla. Sus músculos y su resistencia se han endurecido desde que les encargaron esta extraña misión. Para cumplir su tarea, deben aventurarse por los violentos territorios de un mundo en guerra casi constante. Son cazadores en busca de presas de un tipo muy especial, presas silenciosas, astutas, que no dejan rastro ni huella. Si estos inquietantes emisarios se sentasen en la taberna de algún puerto a beber vino, comer pulpo asado, hablar y emborracharse con desconocidos, nunca lo hacen por prudencia, podrían contar grandes historias de viaje. Se han adentrado en tierras azotadas por la peste, han atravesado comarcas asoladas por incendios, han contemplado las cenizas calientes de la destrucción y la brutalidad de rebeldes y mercenarios en pie de guerra. Como todavía no existen mapas de regiones extensas, se han perdido y han caminado sin rumbo durante días enteros bajo la furia del sol o las tormentas. Han tenido que beber aguas repugnantes que les han causado diarreas monstruosas. Siempre que llueve, los carros y las mulas se atascan en los charcos. Entre gritos y juramentos han tirado de ellos hasta caer de rodillas y besar el barro. Cuando la noche los sorprende lejos de cobijo, solo su capa los protege de los escorpiones. Han conocido el tormento enloquecedor de los piojos y el miedo constante a los bandoleros que infestan los caminos. Muchas veces, cabalgando por inmensas soledades, se les hiela la sangre al imaginar un grupo de bandidos esperándolos, conteniendo el aliento, escondidos en algún recodo del camino, para caer sobre ellos, asesinarlos a sangre fría, robarles la bolsa y abandonar sus cadáveres calientes entre los arbustos. Es lógico que tengan miedo. El rey de Egipto les ha confiado grandes sumas de dinero antes de enviarlos a cumplir sus órdenes a la otra orilla del mar. En aquel tiempo, solo unas décadas después de la muerte de Alejandro, viajar llevando una gran fortuna era muy arriesgado, casi suicida. Y aunque los puñales de los ladrones, las enfermedades contagiosas y los naufragios amenazan con hacer fracasar una misión tan cara, el faraón insiste en enviar sus agentes desde el país del Nilo, cruzando fronteras y grandes distancias en todas las direcciones. Desea apasionadamente, con impaciencia y dolorosa sed de posesión, esas presas que sus cazadores secretos rastrean para él, haciendo frente a peligros ignotos. Los campesinos que se sientan a fisgonear a la puerta de sus cabañas, los mercenarios y los bandidos habrían abierto unos ojos asombrados y una boca incrédula si hubieran sabido qué perseguían los jinetes extranjeros. Libros, buscaban libros. Era el secreto mejor guardado de la corte egipcia. El señor de las dos tierras, uno de los hombres más poderosos del momento, daría la vida, la de otros, claro, siempre es así con los reyes, por conseguir todos los libros del mundo para su gran biblioteca de Alejandría. Perseguía el sueño de una biblioteca absoluta y perfecta, la colección donde reuniría todas las obras de todos los autores desde el principio de los tiempos.
Thank you so much, Irene.
I never
get tired of that passage. It sets the tone for the extraordinary adventure that is the invention of books and the preservation of the written word across the centuries. I'm so thrilled to be able to bring the two of you together today. I think that your work, Sarah, your work really resonates with Irene's work, and Irene's work resonates with yours. You are both scholars of classical texts, and you both write extremely engagingly for the benefit of those of us who are not scholars of classical texts. You make your engagement with these ancient texts thrilling and exciting. Sarah, you write so playfully about Hebrew grammar. I've really never read anything quite like it. In your book, The Face of Water, and Irene, you write of the story of the preservation of texts across time as as an adventure story. It's like reading a really exciting novel. Sarah, I'd like to ask you about your response to Papyrus and what was the experience of reading this book like for you?
Well, thank you both so much for this book. I have a reputation as a really mean reviewer. But you know, as I got older, I certainly mellowed and you know, recognized the need to find what is good in a book and to give every author credit. But I love this book because there was no effort whatsoever. I didn't have to try. I opened it and I was swept away. And
Thank you.
I felt such respect and such affection for your work, and obviously for yourself, as someone, you know, deeply concerned with the book as a humanitarian project, as the thing that's going to save the world if anything does. The written word, and I've never seen such a wonderful tribute to it as this.
Thank you. No, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I think we're done. I think we can go now. I'm always struck in Papyrus by the emphasis on collective labor and the extraordinary figures you bring to light in your work, who were involved in the creation of the first libraries, the development of the alphabet, and these are, you know, there are a great many fascinating individuals here. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about some of your favorites.
Yeah, it's true. You know, literary histories usually focused on creation, on authors, but the transmission, the survival of literature is at least as important as creating. So my protagonists are mainly anonymous people who dedicated their life and labor to safeguard books. And they not only read them, but you know, protected them when books were persecuted by censorship, or they copied them in the time of, you know, manuscripts. It's a very demanding and challenging activity to copy an entire book. And I'm impressed by this succession of acts of love and devotion to books that were taking place in monasteries, in abbeys, in medieval times, back in the ancient time, copyists, slaves, and librarians, and readers, and you know, inventors and travelers and nuns, and this whole humanity who love books and who made it possible for them to last on and on. And my main characters are not emperors or great warriors or kings, but you know, the humanity, the anonymous, the unknown people who are still today part of this adventure, because the books are always facing risks and challenges, and they need still nowadays people saving them and being and feeling this deep bond to reading and books and protecting them from censorship and from other dangers, from accidents. And above all, Papyrus is a book about the history of democratization of access to knowledge, to reading, to art, to culture. And that's why public libraries and bookstores play an essential role in this adventure, because those are the places where people have access to books, and where people, no matter their familiar origins or their economy or their background, they can read, they can have access to books and knowledge. And I think that's an amazing collective achievement that we should remember, celebrate, and protect.
You write so beautifully about fragility. I'm just going to read a couple of lines about the fragility of words. What is a story, after all? A string of words, a sigh, a breath of air that emerges from the lungs, passes the larynx, vibrates on the vocal cords, and takes its definitive shape when the tongue touches the palate, the teeth, or the lips. It seems impossible to save something so fragile. Sarah, how does the way Irene writes about the fragility of ancient texts and their preservation relate to your work as a translator of ancient texts?
Okay. Well, I could start with a problem that classicists always have, and it's in this basic problem is to convince people that the classics are real. The ancient world was real, that history is real on an ongoing basis. And it's remarkable how much frustration, if this is your life's project, how much frustration you're going to encounter, in the text, in the writing of people, who were supposed to be sharing this project, convincing people that classics are not, they're not a video game. They're not well-built, gods and heroes flashing across the screen in a movie. And they're not some, boring, dusty archive. And they're not some pedantic collection of facts. That they're life. They're about life. And I particularly love the way you handle the material in the book about Martial, the Roman poet of the 1st century AD, and author of epigrams. He's a real person. He's a guy. He has all of these problems that we would recognize with making a living, with getting along with people more powerful than himself, and making a permanent home for himself, and yet at the same time he's extraordinary because he's left us something that is still exciting and meaningful for us today. And I think you give us a message that's really significant about how we are all as human beings both very ordinary and extraordinary in our potential. Yeah. I love that.
And I love your insights and the way you talk about humor in ancient world and classics, because we perceive them as being serious and boring, and they are fun. And I mean, we should take them down from their pedestals. They were, Roman and Greeks, they were not exemplary. We are not interested in them because they were perfect. We are interested in them because they were human, just like us. And they have the credit for certain achievements in literature, in the field of ideas and thoughts, but there are shadows there, and shadows of slavery or imperialism and misogyny and many others. So I love your approach to them. They are not a movie, they are not an entertaining display. Yeah. They were true, real people with problems, with contradictions, with passions and fears, and some of them were masters of words, and they left this legacy of air, this legacy of words that so many people was engaged in saving, in preserving, so that we can still read them and learn from them and converse with them, and through this dialogue to get to know ourselves better and to understand ourselves better.
You touched on misogyny.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you both what it's like to specialize in a period during which women were mostly excluded from spaces of learning.
Yeah, I remember talking about it with my Greek teacher at high school, and we both agreed that it was kind of paradox that we were so interested in a culture where we had been unable to teach or maybe to study or to read or to become writers, authors, artists, creators, just for the fact that we were women. So that's true. But on the other side, I think it's the result of a big history of progress that we are able to study them, to read them, to interpret them, and to offer a different image of them, being aware of all that this society had in terms of discrimination or shadows or I don't know. Sarah, what do you think about this paradox?
Something wildly inappropriate has come into my mind now, and I think I'm just going to say it because what can they do to me? When I was listening to your reflections, I was thinking of the Harvard Classics department in the 80s in the graduate program, and women had not been in the grad school. Been in the grad school a little longer, but not in Harvard College for long at all, and we weren't welcome there. And one of the professors said to a woman who was talking in class, "I can't pay any attention to what you're saying. Your breasts are too beautiful." So, yeah, I think we can. Women, all women, in their studies can feel a certain historical continuity. I love your section about women writers. I didn't know that there were so many. And it's a sad story in many ways in that most of them wrote contingent works. So they would write memoirs of their families, or they would write letters of great quality. Some of these women were really brilliant, but of course they couldn't, except for a brief time in the 1st century BC, there weren't women orators. They didn't get out there in that public space. They didn't write the big important works. But the sense of continuity is very touching and encouraging. Yeah. It really is. And we can look and see how far we've come, and that's a great feeling.
Yeah, because we women have to face so many obstacles, and recovering the legacy, the genealogies of the women of the past is important for female creators of nowadays. We need to build these genealogies and to recover the names and to read the text if they have survived, and and visit the grave of the pioneers, the female pioneers of creation and literature, so that the women creators of today, to prevent the women creators of today from falling into tomorrow's oblivion. So we need this sense of continuity, as you were saying, because my studies on the literary canon has showed me that it's far more difficult for works written by women to persist, to forge a tradition, to be recognized after she were dead. So women were recognized when they were alive, but if they had the bad idea of dying, it was the end of it. So, yes. and that's what women scholars can offer, and our contribution can be that, to recover the words, the names, the characters and figures of those women, and to celebrate them.
You know, a gift that you demonstrate, you know, and I'm sure an unintended consequence of our oppression is the earthiness and the vividness of your writing, because women don't have the luxury of, you know, just trotting off to the academy and, you know, getting the straightforward, you know, experience of scholarship, of learning. No, they have to fight for it. And that gives them, and I think especially you, a sense of the immediacy and the importance of every moment of life as it's connected to scholarship, to books, to the printed word. And that connection just isn't made often enough.
You also talk about how orality continued alongside the development of written culture, and that it was often a female space.
Yeah, it's true. The world of oral communication was more democratic because everyone had the tools. So everyone could tell a story, tell a tale, or a poem. Mm-hmm. But when writing emerged, technological revolution is taking place, and you need special skills that reclaim education and belonging to an aristocratic family, or being wealthy at least. So many people were left outside the world of academy, of writing, of education. And, you know, a long struggle starts at this moment to open these walls and to make books again welcoming to everybody, and that has lasted for centuries and centuries. And that's the merit of teachers and professors and librarians and many people throughout the centuries. But I want to emphasize that the word of orality didn't die with the invention of writing, and it was mostly the territory of women. Women telling stories about family, about memory, about poetry, about songs, and that was creation, but was not preserved in our written records. So yeah, that's why we talk about mother language, because women throughout the centuries taught their children to speak, and the language was a gift from mothers. So yeah, it's.
You've just touched on one of my absolute favorite paragraphs from the book. So if it's okay, I'm going to read.
Please.
And yet, since time immemorial, women have told stories, sung songs, and threaded together lines of verse in the glow of the fireside. When I was a little girl, my mother unfurled before me a world of whispered stories. This was no coincidence. Throughout the ages, women have held the role of unraveling stories by night. Women have been the weavers of tales and tapestries. For centuries, they have unspooled their stories as they spun or threw the shuttle on their loom. They were the first to capture the universe as warp and weft. They knotted together their joys, hopes, sorrows, fears, and most private beliefs. They dyed drudgery, giving it color. They interlaced verbs, yarn, adjectives, and silk. This is why text and textiles share so many words. The thread of the story, the denouement of the narrative, the fabric of the argument. Weave a plot, embroider a tale, spin a yarn. This is why the old myths speak to us of Penelope's shroud, Nausicaa's tunics, Arachne's embroidery, Ariadne's thread, the thread of fate spun by the Moirai, the canvas of human fate sewn by the Norns, the magic tapestry of Scheherazade. Now, my mother and I whisper those nighttime stories in my son's ears. Though I am no longer that little girl, I write so the stories won't come to an end. I write because I don't know how to sew or knit. I never learned to embroider. But I am fascinated by the delicate warp and weft of words. I tell of my fantasies wound in a skein of dreams and memories. I feel like an heir to those women who have always woven and unwoven stories. I write so the old thread of voices will not be frayed.
Thank you so much.
I want to ask you both about translation. Sarah, you were a renowned translator of the Aeneid, St. Augustine, the Gospels, and a whole string of other works. And
Aw shucks.
and Irene, I feel that Papyrus is in part a translation project.
Yeah.
Why should we keep translating the classics? Why should there be 20 versions of the Odyssey? Why do we do this? Why do we keep doing it?
Well, I'm what you call a retranslator. So I produce the 1500th version of some essential classic. And what comes to mind first is the political necessity of retranslation, of keeping up with translation, and especially of correcting lazy or mendacious translation. And that's particularly important with the Bible. I have great admiration for the treatment of politics in your book. You speak of your parents making a vow that they wouldn't have a child until Franco was dead. 10 years ago, I think Americans would not have been able to get their mind around it. Now they can. So we have to also start being more politically engaged when we engage with literature, and take a stand, for truth against lies in our politics, in our public life. And the translation of the classics, and especially of sacred literature, is a very good place to start, I think, because otherwise powerful people will claim that they own a particular very important foundational text. It belongs to them. They're going to read it, they're going to interpret it, they're going to translate it, and they're going to hammer the life out of it with the ideology that they pull out of us, with the ideology that they pull from it. that's for me the most cogent reason that we got to be concerned with translation nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, translators are artists, are creators, are authors, so they have to make choices about the text. And as Sarah was saying, books, classic books, are the justification for many ideas and philosophies and political decisions or ideologies. So we need to be very careful about the classics, and we need different cases when it comes to translating the classics. We've been faithful to outdated translations of the Greek and Roman classics, and I found this problem when writing Papyrus. All the translations that the book contains are mine. I did these translations of the text, and I tried to convey this feeling of the classics are alive, and they are passionate, and sometimes they are wrong, but they talk face to face to us. But in some countries, the usual technique is using standard translations of the classics and insert them in the text whenever a classical quote is mentioned. And many of those translations come from the 19th century, and they are Victorian translations. That means with ingredients of bigotry, or they are biased, or they suppress paragraphs because they didn't want to bother the virtues of Victorian women. Mm-hmm. So we are being faithful to translations that are not being faithful to the originals. Every generation needs new translations because the language is always changing. So if we just read Marshall or Plato in the style and ways of the 19th century, we perceive a distance, something that is not talking to our times, to our feelings, to our ideas. And on the other side, it's this political risk of interpretations. So it's a guarantee that every generation is retranslating foundational text and doing it from different perspectives. What about an atheistic translation of the Bible, or a woman translating the Odyssey, or different points of view, different sensitiveness about foundational text, and through this difference, we can debate about the classics, and we can be more faithful to them than just accepting without any critique given versions.
It was fascinating for me to look for standard translations in English to use, and then decide to discard them all because they didn't offer the freshness and immediacy that Irene is claiming the classics have in this book, and so tonally they were completely inappropriate, and we ended up translating Irene's translations into English, so it's kind of a double translation. It was a great exercise, for instance, to read through the translations of Marshall that were done in the 19th century, and you always know when you've reached the most interesting part of the translation because it's blacked out. And I think I translated all of your translations except for one of Marshall's epigrams, and I found a contemporary translation of this one epigram that I thought could not possibly be improved upon by me. The translation is by Gary Wills, and the epigram is, and you'll know immediately why it was blacked out in the Victorian translation. The epigram goes, "Such sexy dances does she imitate, that purity itself must masturbate." So that's the only quote that was not my own work, and I think it's appropriate to give credit where it is due for that. I feel that we could talk for another hour, but we won't be able to do so in this exact configuration. But I do think we have time for some audience questions if there's somewhere out there someone out there with a microphone.
And if you have a question, you can just raise your hand and we'll come over to you with a microphone.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I just want to keep poking on this issue of the translation. I am a native Spanish speaker, and the literal name of the book is not Papyrus. And I was just wondering, how comfortable do you feel with the whole translation that has come from El Infinito en un Junco all the way out to Papyrus? Because for us native Spanish speakers, it's kind of a tricky interpretation of the work, and I just wanted to see how was the sense that you had from that translation in particular.
Yeah, thank you for writing this topic. I tend to trust my publishers and my translators and leave them freedom to change things whenever they think the original could be misleading in the translation, or maybe there is a different perception, or words are so different in different languages. I mean, you can translate it, but the ideas that this word arises are so different. So I love the Spanish title because I devoted a lot of time to get this title, and it was painful and excruciating sometimes. But when my publishers in the Netherlands suggested Papyrus, I thought, well, that point, it makes sense. It's a short title, it's easy to remember. And maybe it conveys the message of the book, because it's like a tribute of different forms and appearances that would have had throughout history. So maybe it's like a short message. It's powerful in its briefness, and I accept it. I feel my books are not entirely mine, and when I work with a translator, even I encourage them to be creative, to change things, to use their freedom, creative freedom, as much as I love mine when I'm writing. And I'm convinced that translators are colleagues, authors, and they have the right to make things in a different way and make decisions, take different decisions. And my concern is that we don't celebrate enough the creativity implied in translation. And I always insist that the name of the translator should always be on the cover of the book, and we need to discriminate good translators from less excellent translators in order to, recognize their importance and make the publishers aware that we notice the difference, and that is not something that doesn't matter. Of course, the decision, the choice of the translator is so important, so essential for the future of the book in other cultures. And I love this sentence by, this sentence is this idea that writers create or build national literatures, while translators create world literature. World literature exists because we have translators. And in Papyrus, I talk about the Library of Alexandria, where probably the first a huge project of translation took place, or at least that we know of. And translation is something wonderful that someone had to invent. It's not that something that we should take for granted, but it changed our societies. Translators brings us together and reach other nationalities and create culture in a broader sense. So it's so important that we have brilliant translators like both of you, and that we give importance to we recognize the importance of this task.
Thank you.
I have nothing to add. I think, do we have time for another question?
Thank you all for being here. I just wanted to reflect on the point of translation. I think early on in the book you talk about this moment when we're moving between an oral culture and a written culture, and how the written word offered this beautiful possibility of preserving a story, but it was also the danger of fixing a single story. And I think right now we're at this really interesting moment where we're talking about a written book. We're in an oral moment where we're talking about it. You're reading out loud, you're performing the book, right? We're on that border of orality and written word in this moment right now in this room. But I also think there's something interesting about translation, where the translator is like that traveling bard who gets to retell the story in their own words. In some ways, there's a story that's been told that they hear, and they go and they retell it, but they retell it to a different audience, to an international audience, and different. It's just a thought I had, but I would love to hear more. You all reflect a little bit about this idea of sort of like translations, maybe the reason why we have 20 translations of the same classic, why we need more translations of the same classic, how it opens up the possibility for the text to be, instead of just fixed, for it to sing in different voices.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned the sort of the suspicion of fixity, and in a similar sense that the translator is a figure who's often been viewed throughout history with a grain of suspicion. There are lots of cliches about things getting lost in translation, or the translator being a traitor, or being engaged in an activity that's somehow deceptive, right? Mm-hmm. Do you also find yourself having to sort of justify your existence?
Oh yes. Well, when the translator touches the Gospels, it's kind of it's like touching the third rail. So, yes, let's say I've had experiences with writing a different word in English than the traditional one for the Greek. Yeah.
I think I feel like a translation is never really finished. I was asked recently at a talk how I knew when a translation was finished, and I think it has to do with this a level of satisfaction that I have with how the translation sounds, and I read it over and over aloud to myself and try to find the right rhythm, and I know that the rhythm isn't there yet if my tongue trips over the sort of cadence, and the cadence isn't quite right. But I might also say that the translation is ready when the editor wrests it from my hands, because I'm still thinking about how many alternatives there really are. There's a beautiful memoir by Mireille Goncel called Translation as Transhumance, where she describes translation as a delicate seismograph at the heart of time. And I think she's trying to get at that idea that we might retranslate the same text, that we've revisit the same translation years later and translate it differently because it's a subjective kind of a work.
Yeah, but it's the same thing with creation. Maybe an author would write a different page years after, and we face the same difficulty to consider the work finished. So for me, that means that there are related activities, not so different as one could think. And on the other side, I, as a philologist, think that we are like obsessed by the fixation of the definitive text, just one version of the text, and we are like confronting different manuscripts and versions and thinking and over what's the best word in every sentence. But we should remember that telling stories was something different in orality. It was like improvising a text that was flowing and not trying to be something definitive, because other people will take over with this story. That story didn't belong to you. You was just part of a chain, and every performance of a story was different. It's impossible to reproduce every word when you are talking aloud, and maybe we are like recovering the essence of stories when we translate it, and when we allow them to change and to be different in word, in music, because the music translation is completely different from the original. In the spirit of Sant Jordi, we should definitely celebrate multiple versions, multiple languages, and we are celebrating like the legacy of William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes, but also El Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. So different languages, different ways of understanding reality, a gaze from different continents, and the plurality of words and versions. And we have had wars, fighting for the right interpretation of religious text, and people had died and had been killed because of defending this or that version of this text.
Just as they are dying in the prologue of
Papyrus
in search of these precious, valuable
and with
manuscripts.
Vulgata, the Vulgata was like declared more faithful than the original, and in some regions it was forbidden to translate from the original text, because you have to stick to the Vulgata. And for instance, Fray Luis de Leon was put into jail because he dared to translate the Cantar of Cantares from the original Hebrew text.
I'm going to just intervene and ask if we're out of time. Are we?
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Hey, great job, all three of you. I'm really psyched to be here to talk. So I have a question about the transition from oral to written literature. yeah, so I was working on a dictionary with this indigenous friend of mine, and we found that all of the indigenous languages, there's a dictionary, and it's put up by the Summer Institute, the Instituto de Verano, yeah, Instituto Lingüística de Verano, and so which has compiled these extensive dictionaries of indigenous languages to translate the Bible. So it's this very direct expression of colonialism, imperialism, also the suppression of oral culture, women's culture, female culture, and then we have the same idea of the newspapers as sort of having this uniformity, homogenization of national culture. So I was just wondering whether writing constitutes some sort of violence, or what sort of relationship there is between written and oral culture, whether it's a trace of oral resistance within written texts, or how does that, just like politically, how does that relationship manifest itself?
Yeah, it's quite an issue. This passage from the oral culture to writing culture in Greece, in fact, it was peaceful process. It was, desire acquisition, written culture, and the alphabet, and was, they did it from inside, from the Greek culture, but sometimes it has been imposed on societies through colonialism, from foreign people coming with their alphabet, with their written culture, and imposed with violence to the indigenous people, to the natives. So yeah, sometimes written culture has been like the orthodoxy imposed, and oral cultures try to preserve their existence as an act of rebellion, or trying to preserve their culture. So it's something ambiguous sometimes, because writing helps the preservation of texts and cultures and ideas and beliefs, but at the same time, when it's translated into another language or into another imaginary, it can be changed or transformed, or have this kind of superiority from those who write towards those who are just part of an oral culture. So it's different in different environments and cultures and historical contexts. But I have huge admiration for oral culture. Sometimes we feel oral cultures are less developed as societies than written cultures, but that's not true. And we know of incredible, brilliant storytellers that are illiterate, and they preserve memories and stories, and when they die, a part of huge culture, a brilliant culture, is dying with them. So it's not so clear as it could seem. The progress is not always in the part of written and tradition or the past in the part of oral culture. Sometimes the coexistence of both cultures is the only guarantee that all the possibilities, all the regards or the ideas is preserved. So one has to be very careful when dealing with oral cultures, oral societies, and the way they made this passage to their written culture without feeling the imposition of other cultures or the superiority or colonialism, to summarize it, you know.
Thank you both so very much for being here today. Thank you to the Center for Fiction and to Mary Ann, the director of the San Jordi Festival, and thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate books and roses. We will be giving out roses, I think, and Irene will be signing books in the bookstore. Is there anything you need to say about that?
You are all invited to the signing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Could we have another round of applause?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You were terrific.
As mentioned, we're going to have a really special personalization line that involves both signing books and roses, since we are celebrating the